Hey there, novelteers. Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about originality in writing and does it matter? It turns out the answer is no, it does not. Now you might be surprised to hear this, but originality doesn't matter when it comes to writing a novel. In fact, what really matters is writing a compelling story and well-developed characters. So sit back, grab a Frappuccino, and let's talk about this. And yes, I've started drinking Frappuccinos. They're really good. But before we begin, I have an exciting offer for you. If you're looking for help writing your book, I've created a free guide that provides a simple and effective process to help you outline your book in an hour. This is based on my own experience of writing 200 books as a ghostwriter and 24 on my own. You can download that guide at the link provided below. Enough for the pitch, though. Now let's talk about how your book doesn't need to be original to be a massive success. I can already hear some of you saying, what do you mean originality isn't important? Isn't it important to be unique? Well, no. Because here's the thing. There are only about 22 plots in the world, and some people would say there's only 7 plots in the world. This all depends on who you ask. But regardless of what the actual number is, every story we read or watch is essentially a variation of these limited number of plots. So rather than obsessing over being completely original, you need to focus on how you can put a unique spin on these plots. Let's look at a classic example. Dracula, one of my favorite books. Okay, I know I have a new favorite book every week, but that's beside the point. Bram Stoker's novel Dracula is one of the most famous vampire books of all time. It established tropes that we still see in vampire books today. Only, it didn't actually establish any of those tropes. The fact is, those tropes were established years before by several different authors you probably have never heard of. The Vampire, with a Y, by John William Polidori, and no, I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that right, published his book in 1819. He created the tropes. He turned the vampire, which before this was always a demon that did not look human, into something that looked human. And that's not the only change he made. His vampire, which his name was Lord Ruthven, I think I'm pronouncing that right, embodied the seductive and enigmatic figure that would become a staple of vampire lore for, many decades to come. Centuries to come, really. Now, Polidori's The Vampire, with a Y, introduced the concept of the undead predator haunting the nights. It also established things like the stake and things like that. And building on Polidori's foundation, James Malcolm Rymer contributed the development of vampire tropes with his work Varney the Vampire and the Feast of Blood, isn't that a great title, published in 1847. And if you haven't read that one, I don't blame you. At 109 chapters and 667,000 words, it's considered one of the longest vampire novels ever written. Nobody's really read it. Of course, it's unfair to call that a novel since it was actually a serialized book published one chapter at a time every week for 2 years. If it had been written today, it would be broken up into at least a quadrilogy or more with that many words, just like Harry Potter was. Anyway, Varney the Vampire introduced the idea of the reluctant vampire, a vampire plagued by guilt and self-loathing, a vampire with a tortured past. This book refined and expanded upon Polidori's vampire foundation and wove a complex narrative that explored the tormented existence of Varney and the neighbor he had his eye on. Rymer's contribution added depth to the vampire archetype and showcased their inner structure and psychological turmoil. This is something that was done again years later with Dark Shadows. However, it was Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, published in 1872, that actually perfected and solidified many of the vampire tropes we recognize today. Le Fanu, again, I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that right, his novella dived into the theme of the female vampire, introducing Carmilla, who was mesmerizing and alluring and completely seductive. This narrative actually explored the sensual and homoerotic undertones of the vampire genre, leaving a mark on subsequent works. Now, of the 3, this book was the only one that actually did get a movie, but the movie wasn't mainstream, and now it's really even too obscure to become a cult favorite. Anyway, after a full 12 years after Carmilla was published was when Dracula emerged onto the literary scene. It wasn't new. It wasn't original. Stoker's novel drew and synthesized the various tropes that had been developed over the preceding decades by these three writers. Now don't get me wrong, I love Dracula. It's a masterpiece. It showcases a richly complex and formidable vampire in Count Dracula, and the other characters are remarkably well written and well developed. But once you've actually read Polidori, Reimer, and Le Fanu, you realize there's nothing original about that book Dracula. But Stoker did do it better. And because Stoker did do it better, Dracula remains an iconic and widely celebrated vampire novel while the others faded into obscurity. Being original did not help those three authors. Stoker didn't bother being original. He devoted himself to writing a better, less original story, and that paid off for him big time. It's not about who did it first, but rather who did it best. And who did it best could totally be you. Still not convinced? Well, let's keep following the vampire in the pop culture world. Over the years, vampires have fallen in and out of favor. Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire brought a renewed interest in them in the 1970s. But that book wasn't original either. It actually borrowed heavily from Varney the Vampire and his reluctantness. Then the Twilight series exploded, and vampires again became popular in the early 2000s. They built up the sexual themes pioneered by Carmilla and other stories since then. And that's the thing. Stories like Twilight, stories like Interview with the Vampire, they might not be the most original in terms of the underlying concept, but they resonated with audiences because they delivered engaging narratives and memorable characters and their author's own unique spin on it. That's what readers want. Okay, do you want a more modern example that has nothing to do with vampires? Let's do that. Let's take a look at what Lord of the Rings, Star Wars: A New Hope, Harry Potter, and The Legend of Perseus have in common. Give up? Well, they were all based on the timeless plot of the Chosen One versus the Dark Lord. The Dark Lords in this case being Sauron from Lord of the Rings, Darth Vader from Star Wars: A New Hope, Voldemort from Harry Potter, and Polydectes, and I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that right, of ancient myth. And these stories could not be more different. After all, Lord of the Rings is high fantasy, Star Wars is a space opera, Harry Potter is a modern fantasy, and Perseus, well, that's an ancient story. They don't look like they have anything in common until you actually look closer, because at their core, these four stories share a remarkable similarity. A narrative foundation centered on the Chosen One. This Chosen One is fated to confront and ultimately triumph over the looming darkness of a formidable antagonist. Now you might rightfully wonder, hold on a second. These franchises are incredibly popular and successful, and they're not very much like each other. And you would be correct that Harry Potter, Star Wars, and Lord of the Rings were immensely successful. They enchanted the minds and hearts of countless individuals around the world. And that's the point, because they were both original and not. It's essential to acknowledge the fact that a chosen hero combating a malevolent force or a dark lord is not really exclusive to these sagas. It's an ancient story. That's why I added the story of Perseus to this list, to prove that this plot is as old as recorded history. And not only that, but this plot still works. This plot is always going to work. Across history, diverse stories of a courageous protagonist defeating an evil, the concept of the Chosen One embarking on a noble quest to save the world has always been deeply entwined with our culture. That's what fairy tales are based on. But what sets these three narratives apart, despite sharing a common structural framework, are the intricately crafted characters and painstakingly constructed realms and the artistry of storytelling employed by Rowling, Lucas, and Tolkien. All three of them use their own unique spin and interests to create a grand tapestry inhabited by iconic characters that have become ingrained in our social collective consciousness. And that's the power of a unique spin on an old story. Rather than fixating on being original, focus on developing your engaging characters, crafting immersive worlds, and delivering compelling narratives. Your unique voice and perspective will naturally shine through, even if your story draws inspiration from familiar themes or plots. After all, there's an old saying, as politically incorrect as it is, and don't bother saying that in the comments, I know it's politically incorrect, that settlers get fat and pioneers get slaughtered. And that certainly proved true for Polidori, Reimer, and Le Fanu, who pioneered the modern vampire story. and did not get rich and famous from it. But the fact is, some of the most successful authors of all time have thrived by putting their own spin on familiar stories. Disney, Neil Gaiman, Marissa Meyer, Margaret Atwood, and of course, Gregory Maguire. He wrote Wicked. And there's also the consideration of retellings of classic fairy tales, which of course is what Disney does. But it's not just Disney. Countless authors have reimagined tales like Cinderella, Snow White, or Beauty and the Beast, and have given them a fresh new modern twist, changing their genres, changing them to the past, present, or future, to anywhere you want. And these retellings have resonated with audiences because they offer new perspectives and explore untold aspects of the story, and they breathe new life into beloved characters. So whether it's the hero's journey, or the underdog's triumph, or the chosen one versus the Dark Lord, or the forbidden love, these narratives resonate with us because they tap into our universal emotions and experiences. The human condition is not unique to any one individual or culture. That's what makes it the human condition. We all share common struggles, desires, and dreams, and it's through stories that we connect with others. We use those to explore different perspectives and find meaning in our own lives. So now that we've established that originality isn't the be-all and end-all when it comes to stories, let's explore why it's not as crucial as we might think. First and foremost, storytelling is a fundamental part of human nature. We've done this long before recorded history. If all our technology went away tomorrow, we would still do this. People have shared stories, passed down from myths and legends, and entertained each other with tales forever. It's part of being human. And these stories often follow similar patterns or themes. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying you should outright copy someone else's work. Plagiarism is a serious offense, and it's important to respect the creative efforts of others, and now with that legal PSA out of the way, what I am saying is you shouldn't be afraid to explore familiar territory. It's not going to hurt your book. It might help it. Embrace the fact that storytelling is a collective endeavor. Build upon the foundation laid by those who came before you, and bring your unique voice and perspective to the narrative. Readers are often drawn to certain genres or story types because they enjoy the familiar elements and themes associated with them. Look at genre fiction. Genres like romance, mystery, and science fiction are built on established conventions and tropes. Readers of these genres often seek out familiar story structures and themes. It's the execution that sets a story apart, not necessarily the originality or the concept. So instead of fixating on being completely unique, focus on creating memorable characters, well-crafted plot lines, immersive worlds, and other things that captivate your readers. Because it's natural to worry that your work might be seen as derivative or lacking in originality. But we've already established that it's important to remember no two authors will tell the same story in the exact same way, even if they're told to both rewrite the Cinderella story. It's your unique voice, perspective, and life experiences that's going to shape your storytelling, even if the overarching plot or themes resemble those of other works. Now, this is actually true of any art form, not just writing. Back when I was in art school, my figure sculpting teacher taught us a certain way to sculpt a figure, just like him. And a student asked, wasn't he worried we were all going to copy him? And he laughed and said that no, only the first few sculptures were going to look like his. After that, we develop our own style because it's impossible not to. Writing is the same. And as you write and rewrite your stories, your own style and unique perspective will naturally take over. That's how creativity works. The fact is, embracing familiar story elements can be a powerful tool for building connections with your readers. Once they recognize a familiar trope or narrative structure, it creates a sense of comfort and anticipation. It's like meeting an old friend in a new setting. They know what to expect to some extent, but they're also excited to see how you put your own spin on it. That matters to them. So how can you make your story stand out in a sea of similar narratives? Well, let's go over a few tips to help you balance between familiarity and innovation. Of course, regardless of plot, readers are drawn to characters they connect with and root for. Focus on creating well-rounded individuals with unique personalities, motivations, and flaws. After all, if I asked you what you liked best about Harry Potter, Star Wars, or Lord of the Rings, you're undoubtedly going to tell me about your favorite character or the character that you love to hate. You're not going to tell me about a plot point. Next, craft engaging and unpredictable plot lines. While the overall structure of a story might be familiar, the journey within that structure should offer surprises, twists, and turns. Keep your readers on their toes and make them eager to find out what happens next. Explore new angles and new perspectives. Even within a familiar narrative framework, there's always room to delve deeper. You should challenge assumptions and present fresh viewpoints. Consider untold stories or lesser explored aspects of your chosen plot and bring them to the forefront. Next, you can play with themes or subvert expectations. Take familiar themes and tropes and subvert them in unexpected ways. Flip the script, challenge stereotypes, and explore alternative outcomes. This can breathe new life into well-known concepts and make your story truly memorable. If you want to see an example of this, check out the Final Girls Support Group, which is a book about so-called final girls who are in a support group and then, of course, they get stalked again from horror movies. Now keep in mind, the key to creating a compelling novel lies in your ability to craft a well-executed story and bring your characters to life. It's not about reinventing the wheel, but how well you can actually roll with the wheel. So in writing your story, just keep that in mind. And you will always have an audience.